I'm Alexandra Hartman. I'm 37 years old, a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, and I run the Multi-Purpose Canine Program for Naval Special Warfare Group 2. For 10 years, I swallowed the small cruelties of a man who had decided I was beneath his family before he ever shook my hand. I did it because my husband, a senior chief, a SEAL, a kind man, asked me to be patient with his father. I was patient for 10 years. But when my father-in-law hissed at our war dog at my husband's memorial and called him a mutt, a rear admiral stood up in the front pew and decided he'd had enough of that for both of us. Have you ever been belittled by someone you gave a decade of patience to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after years of swallowing it, hit that like button and subscribe. My husband was Senior Chief Petty Officer Caleb Whitman, SEAL Team 4. He was killed in action 1 year ago this April, in a country I'm not allowed to name, doing work I'm not allowed to describe. The dog asleep at my boots right now is named Reaper. He is a black Belgian Malinois. He is 9 years old. He has been on 8 combat deployments. He has a silver star pinned through the loop of his service harness. And in the small, very specific way that the Naval Special Warfare community keeps these things, he holds the honorary rank of Master Chief Petty Officer. He is the reason I get out of bed. This is a story about the year after Caleb died. It is a story about a man named Walter Whitman, who is my father-in-law. It is a story about a memorial at a base chapel in Norfolk on a clear, cool morning in April, and what happened in the aisle between the back pew and the family pew. It is a story about a single sentence said quietly by a rear admiral, and what that sentence did to a 68-year-old retired chief who had spent his entire adult life believing he was the most important sailor in the room. But to tell that, I have to start somewhere else. I have to start at a chain-link gate. I met Caleb in 2014. I was 25. I was a Navy Master-at-Arms Chief Petty Officer, the youngest E7 in my command, and I was scrubbing the floor of a kennel run at Naval Station Norfolk on a Saturday morning in April because I had drawn duty and I wanted my dogs to come back to a clean run. My uniform was wet to the knees. My hair was in a regulation bun that had collapsed 2 hours earlier. I had a bleach burn on the inside of my forearm. I was happy. I heard him before I saw him. Boots on concrete. He stopped at the gate. Then he leaned on the chain link, very casually, like a man with nowhere else to be. And he said, "Chief, that's the cleanest kennel run I've ever seen." I did not look up. I said, "Then you've never seen a clean kennel." He laughed. I glanced at him then. He was a petty officer first class in PT gear with a name patch on his sweatshirt that read, Whitman, in plain black tape. He had a trident pin on a key lanyard around his neck, which was the only reason I knew he was a SEAL. He was 29 years old. He had blue eyes the color of morning light through a screen door. He came back the next day, and the day after, and the day after. He never asked for my number. He just kept showing up at the kennel and asking if he could help. I let him hold a leash for the first time 2 weeks in. He was good with the dogs. I told him so. He said, "Chief, dogs are easy. People are the part I'm bad at." I told him I would teach him. I did not know yet that I was telling him the truth. We were married 2 years later. The chapel was on base. I wore Navy service dress whites because that was who I was. He wore Navy service dress blues because that was who he was. There were 40 people. 24 of them were in some shade of Navy uniform, including his entire team and most of mine. My mother flew in from Sacramento. My father did not. Caleb's mother had been gone a long time by then, and his sister Beth flew in from Richmond, and his Aunt Diane drove down from Annapolis, and his brother sent a card. And there, in the front pew, in a gray suit that had not fit him since the Clinton administration, was Caleb's father, Walt. Walt did not hug me at our wedding. He did not hug me at our reception. When the receiving line reached him, he took my hand the way you might take the hand of a stranger at a funeral home. And he said, perfectly evenly, "Welcome to the family, ma'am." Caleb beside me said, with tightness in his jaw I would learn to recognize, "Dad, she's not a stranger. She's your daughter now." And Walt, with that little smile he saved for moments he wanted to win, said, "She's a chief. She'll always be a chief to me." I did not understand it then. I would, in time. Walt had served 30 years in the United States Navy as a storekeeper, which is a logistics specialist. He had retired in 2006 as a chief petty officer, pay grade E7, after being passed over twice for senior chief and refusing on principle to compete a third time. Walt believed chief was the highest rank that mattered. Officers, in Walt's private mythology, were children. Senior chiefs were politicians. Master chiefs were unicorns who had betrayed the deck plate. SEALs were tourists. Working dogs were a circus act. To Walt, every other career path in the Navy was an insult to his. Reaper came into my life in 2019. I was 30. I had just commissioned that year as an ensign through the Limited Duty Officer program, after 11 years enlisted as a Master-at-Arms K-9 handler. And I had been assigned to my first officer billet at the Naval Special Warfare Group 2 multi-purpose K-9 kennel as a junior officer in the Working Dog program. A transport van pulled up to the gate one Tuesday morning with 3 new MPCs from a Belgian breeder, and the second crate door swung open, and a 2-year-old black Malinois with copper-tipped ears lunged out, ignored everyone, found my boots, and peed directly on the right one. The kennel master, a master chief named Sokolov, who is now retired in Florida, said, "Ma'am, you want me to write that one up?" I was laughing. I was laughing for the first time, I realized, in months. I had buried a friend that February. I had been through a hard winter. I said, "Master Chief, he's mine. We're going to get along." And I bent down and I scratched the dog's ear and I said to him quietly, "Hi, Reaper. I'm Ensign Hartman. We are going to be a problem for somebody." I did not know yet that 2 years later, Caleb would become his primary handler. I did not know yet that the dog I was scratching behind the ear in 2019 would, in 2024, take 7.62 millimeter rounds across his backplate to keep 2 operators alive. I did not know yet that the dog would outlive my husband. I did not know any of it. I just knew, that morning at the kennel, that I had been very tired, and that the dog had peed on me, and that for some reason it had made me feel, for the first time in a hard year, like the world was still moving forward without my permission, and that this was a relief. That is the bond at the start of this story. That is what you need to understand before I take you to the chapel. There was a kennel, there was a gate, there was a chief in a wet uniform laughing at a dog. And then there was a SEAL who came back the next day, and the day after, until he was the man I married, and then there was a war dog who did not yet know any of our names, but would in time learn them all. The first 10 years with Walt as a father-in-law were not warm, but they were tolerable. I will not pretend otherwise. He was sour, he was stiff, he was a little man in a tract house in suburban Virginia who believed his 30 years of stateside paperwork meant he had earned the right to lecture his SEAL son about real Navy work. But he never raised his voice at me, he never put his hands on me, he kept his cruelty in the size and shape of a small hand. He was, for 10 years, a man I could absorb. So I did. Because Caleb asked me to. Because Caleb's mother had left when Caleb was 9, and Beth was 8, and the brother was 12, and Caleb was the only one who had stayed in regular contact with their father. And Caleb had told me, plainly, in the 2nd month of our dating, "My dad is going to be impossible. I love him because he is my dad. I'm not asking you to love him. I'm asking you to be patient." I was patient, for 10 years. But things began to crack the year Caleb made senior chief. That was 2022. He was 37 years old, 18 years into his career, and he had finally pinned on his anchors and stars. The pinning ceremony was at the SEAL Team 4 quarterdeck. I was a lieutenant by then, freshly promoted, in service whites with my LT bars on my collar. Walt was in a polo shirt with a chief petty officer ball cap. He shook Caleb's hand. He looked at the stars on Caleb's collar device. He said, with that same little winning smile, "Senior Chief, well, don't let it go to your head, son. They give those out a lot easier these days." Caleb, who never raised his voice at his father, said quietly, "Dad, stop." And I, who had spent 8 years swallowing the small swipes, looked at my husband and saw, for the first time, that he was not absorbing it as well as I had thought. I made lieutenant commander on the Mustang timeline in 2023. I was 34. Caleb was the first call, my mother was the second. Walt was the third, because Caleb asked me to. He picked up on the second ring. I told him. There was a silence. And then he said, with the deliberate slowness of a man who has been rehearsing a sentence for 10 years, "Lieutenant Commander, that's nice. You know what they used to call us? Mustangs. Used to be a compliment. Used to mean you knew the deck better than the boys with degrees. Now it just means you took the shortcut. I said. Walt, the LDO board is not a shortcut. He said, whatever you say, ma'am. And he hung up. Caleb apologized for him on the phone that night. I told my husband, and I meant it, that he did not have to apologize for his father anymore. I said, I am done being patient. I am polite, I am professional, but I am done being patient. He said he understood. I knew that he didn't, fully, because Caleb had been raised to believe that his father's smallness was somehow his to carry. He carried it the rest of his life. In the fall of 2024, the SEAL community held a closed-door ceremony at Nest Group 2 for Reaper. He was 7 years old. He had just come home from a deployment in which a stack got compromised on a target, and Reaper, who was trained to clear forward, had stopped on a rooftop and refused to come back when called, because 2 operators had gone down behind him, and he had laid himself across both of them under direct fire from a window 20 meters away. He took 2 rounds across his Kevlar plate. He did not move. Both operators were extracted alive. They are both still alive today. The Naval Special Warfare community awarded Reaper its highest non-citation honor that fall, in tradition, recognizing him with the honorary rank of Master Chief Petty Officer. Caleb stood beside him in service dress, his hand on the dog's neck. I, in my LCDR shoulder boards, read the citation aloud. I will read part of it now, because it matters. For shielding 2 wounded operators under sustained enemy fire with deliberate disregard for his own safety, Reaper, multi-purpose canine, is hereby acknowledged with the honorary rank of Master Chief Petty Officer of the Naval Special Warfare community. He is the dog. We are honored to follow him. Walt was not invited to that ceremony. The ceremony was closed to operators, their direct family, and a small handful of senior command. Walt found out about it through Beth 3 weeks later. He called me, he said. I should have been at that. I am his father. And I said, Walt? The honor was for the dog, not for Caleb. You would not have understood it. He said, Alexandra, you are getting above yourself. I said, Walt, I have been above you for 3 years. You just hadn't noticed. That was the first time I had ever spoken to him like that. I remember the silence on the line afterward. He did not have a sentence ready for that one. Eventually he hung up. Caleb's last deployment was at the end of 2024. The night before he left, he sat on the floor of our living room with Reaper in his lap, scratching behind the dog's ears, and he said something to me he had never said before. He said, Alexandra, if anything happens out there, the dog comes home with you, not to my dad. Promise me. I was standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. I almost dropped one. I said, Caleb, why are you saying this? He said, because I'm tired and I want to say it once. Promise me. I promised him. He kissed me on the top of the head. He left the next morning at 0400. The car came at 0345. He was gone before sunrise. In April of 2025, 2 officers in service whites stood on my front porch at 0700 hours on a Tuesday morning. Reaper was behind me in the hallway. Reaper, who had been deployed with Caleb but had been pulled to the rear 2 days before the operation that killed him, was at my heel, in the house, in his service vest, sitting without being asked. He already knew. Dogs always know first. I do not remember most of the rest of that month. The year between Caleb's death and the memorial was the longest year of my life, and also the year I have the least clear memory of. I went to work, I ran my program, I took good care of Reaper, I cried in the shower in the mornings, I slept poorly, I ate at irregular hours. I held the line at work because the program was Caleb's love, and I would not let it suffer because I was suffering. The kennel master, a senior chief named Marcos, who had served with Caleb at Team 4 years before, took on more than his share. He never asked me how I was. He just brought me coffee in the mornings and made sure the junior handlers did not see me on the days when the grief was sitting on my face. The kennel was the only place in my life that did not require translation that year. The dogs did not need to be told what had happened. They did not ask. They simply came to the gate when I walked up and pressed their heads to my hand the way working dogs do. And that was enough. The handlers learned the rhythm of my grief without ever discussing it. On the harder mornings, somebody would say, "Ma'am, want me to take the duty board today?" And I would say, "Please." On the easier mornings, I took the board myself, and Reaper would sit beside my desk while I ran rotation schedules, and I would feel for 30 minutes at a time almost like a lieutenant commander again, instead of a widow with a pen. The grief did not get smaller that year. The room around it got bigger. That is how grief works, when nobody is making it your full-time job. Reaper, in those months, slept on the floor of my bedroom with his back against my closet door. He did not whine. He did not pace. He simply held the doorway in the old way working dogs hold doorways, as if there was still something out there that might need shielding. Once in August, I woke at 3 a.m. and found him sitting at the foot of the bed, staring at me. I said, "Bud, go to sleep." He sighed, the long old sigh of a working dog who has decided to forgive his handler for an unprofessional moment, and he laid back down. I do not know how long he had been watching me. I do not need to know. Walt spent that year trying to control the funeral. He had insisted on hosting the wake at his house. He had insisted on what photos went on the program. He had told extended family, in a phrase I learned later from Beth, that Reaper was the reason Caleb died. Reaper, who had been pulled rear 2 days before the operation. Reaper, who had 8 combat deployments, 2 rounds in his armor plate, and a Silver Star streamer pinned through his harness. Reaper, who had taken to sleeping with his nose against Caleb's pillow on my side of the bed and would not move when I tried to coax him off. I did not respond to Walt's narrative that year. I had a war to attend at work. I told myself I would deal with him after the 1-year mark. I told myself the memorial was the line. I told myself very privately that whatever Walt did at the memorial, I would absorb it for 1 more day, because Caleb had asked me to be patient with his father, and I owed Caleb 1 last day of patience. I was wrong about that. As it turned out, I would not have to absorb it. As it turned out, somebody else was going to handle it for me. The 1-year memorial was held at the Naval Station Norfolk Base Chapel on a Tuesday morning in late April of 2026 at 1100 hours. The chapel was full. Caleb's SEAL team was there. Most of NSW Group 2 was there. Walt, in a dark suit that was a size too large for him, was in the front pew with Beth and the brother and Aunt Diane. Caleb's high school football coach, a man Caleb had not seen in 22 years, was scheduled to speak. Walt's brother, who had not spoken to Walt in 2 decades, was scheduled to speak. Walt was scheduled to speak. I was not scheduled to speak. Walt and I had agreed 3 weeks earlier on a tight phone call that I would not be in the program. He had said it would be less complicated for everyone. I had said, fine, I was the widow. I was furniture. I arrived at the chapel at 10:45 hours. I was in service dress blues, my LCDR shoulder boards, my ribbons. Reaper was at my left heel in his clean working harness, his Silver Star streamer pinned through the loop, the small black and white service dog patch on his vest. He had been bathed 2 days earlier, and his coat was glossy and his eyes were bright. He was 9 years old and he was tired in the mornings now, but at the chapel he was, as he always was, perfectly composed. I had not asked Walt's permission to bring Reaper. It had not occurred to me that I needed to. The dog had been at every important day of Caleb's adult life. He was going to be at the last one. I walked into the back of the chapel with Reaper at heel. The chapel was full, heads turned. I felt some of the seals, 3 or 4 pews up from the back, register the dog and turn slightly. I felt the warmth of that. I started walking up the center aisle, Reaper at my left heel. Perfect. Walt stepped out of the front pew and into the aisle. He was about 30 feet ahead of me when he did it. I saw him do it. I saw his face change when he saw Reaper. I saw the look I had been seeing for 10 years. A small look, a small mouth, the look of a man who has just decided he is the most important person in the room. He held up one hand. He said, low, but loud enough for the front 5 rows to hear, "Alexandra, get that Mutt out of here. Dogs don't belong in a church." The chapel went quiet. Quiet the way only a chapel full of people in uniform can go quiet. I stopped. Reaper stopped at my heel. He did not move. I have trained working dogs for 18 years. He sat without being asked because he had been trained to sit when his handler stopped, but more than that, he did it because he could feel my chest. He could feel the way my breathing had just changed. I said, "Walt, step aside." Walt said, I will not have my son's memorial turned into a circus. Take the animal home." He said the word, animal, the way a small man says a word he has been saving up. There was a ripple in the SEAL pews. 3 or 4 men started to stand. I did not look at them. I was looking at Walt. I was deciding which sentence I was going to say. I had several sentences ready. I had been carrying them around for a year. I did not get to use them, because in the front row, in the second seat in from the aisle, a man stood up. He was 56 years old. He was in service dress blue, 2 stars on each shoulder, 3 rows of ribbons on his chest. The trident pin sat above the ribbons where it always sat. His hair was iron gray. His eyes were calm. He had not been in the program. He had flown in from Coronado that morning at 0500 Pacific. He had been in the front pew since 0930 hours, sitting 2 seats over from Walt, who had not recognized him, because Walt did not pay attention to the kind of people who were senior to him. Rear Admiral James Ellington, Naval Special Warfare, commander of NSW Group 1, Caleb's old commanding officer at SEAL Team 4. The man who, in 2005, had personally pinned Caleb's trident on him after Caleb completed BUD/S. The senior SEAL flag officer on the West Coast, the most decorated active operator I knew personally, and the only flag officer in my life who insisted, in private, that I call him James. He stood. He raised one hand, the way old officers do. A short, flat motion, palm down, and the SEALs 3 rows back, who had started to rise, sat back down. He stepped out of the pew. He walked, in measured footsteps, down the aisle toward us. The chapel did not breathe. Somebody coughed once, and then was silent. Walt, in the aisle, watched Ellington come without seeming to understand who he was looking at. I understood. Reaper understood in the way dogs always understand a flag officer in dress blues. Reaper's tail beat once, slowly, against the floor. Ellington stopped about 3 feet short of us. He did not look at Walt. He looked at the dog. He went down on one knee, slowly because he was 56, and he reached out and scratched Reaper under the chin. Reaper, who has been around a lot of admirals, leaned into him. Ellington said very quietly, "Hey, Master Chief." Then he stood up. He turned to Walt. His voice did not raise. The chapel could still hear every word. He said, "Chief Whitman, I'm Rear Admiral James Ellington, Naval Special Warfare. I'd like to clear something up before we sit down." Walt said, "Sir," because his Navy training was older than his bitterness, and even Walt knew what a Rear Admiral was when he saw one in dress blues. Ellington said, "This is Reaper, Multi-Purpose Canine, Naval Special Warfare Group 2. 8 combat deployments, Silver Star, 2024, for shielding 2 operators with his body under direct fire." He paused. By tradition, he holds honorary rank of Master Chief Petty Officer, pay grade E9. You retired as a Chief Petty Officer, pay grade E7. I'm sure you remember pay grades, Chief. He waited. Walt did not say anything. Ellington said, "That K9 outranks you." Walt did not move. His hands hung at his sides, his jaw worked once. He did not look at me, he did not look at the dog. He stared at Ellington, and he could not assemble a sentence. Ellington said, "He came to bury his battle buddy. We invited him. Take your seat, Chief Whitman." 2 pews behind him, a Master Chief in dress blues stood and came to attention. I watched it happen, as if from a great distance. Then a Senior Chief, the next pew up. Then the 4 operators of Caleb's team, all at once. Then the rest of the SEAL pews. Then the chaplain at the altar. Then the Kennel Master Marcos, who had been sitting with my staff in the back, and behind him, the 7 young handlers of my program in their service dress, every single one of them on their feet, every one of them quiet. Then Ellington's aide, a lieutenant who had been waiting in the back. Then a Master Chief from Caleb's old team, sitting with his wife. Then the wife stood too. Then half the remaining pews, civilian family, friends of Caleb's, neighbors who had driven down, stood with them, because that was what the room was doing. The chapel, end to end, on its feet. Walt, alone in the aisle, at parade rest, he had not chosen. I did not look at Walt. I looked at Reaper. He was sitting at my left heel with his eyes on Ellington. I lowered my hand and said, "Heel," very softly, because it was the only word I could trust myself to say without my voice breaking. I walked down the aisle to the family pew, Reaper walked beside me. Behind me, I heard the soft sound of Walt taking his seat. I did not turn to look at him. I sat down in the pew. Reaper folded into a sphinx pose at my shoe. The room sat down, slowly, in a long, settling wave. The chaplain started speaking. The service began. I do not remember the speeches. I do not remember the football coach. I remember the trident on the casket flag, and I remember Reaper's silver-flecked muzzle on the toe of my boot. And I remember thinking, very clearly, he tried to make this his last small day, and he failed. I drove home from the chapel at 1400 hours with Reaper in the passenger seat. I had not gone to the reception. The reception had been at Walt's house, and Beth had called me as I was leaving the chapel parking lot to tell me, in tears, that Walt had not come to his own reception either, that he had driven home alone, that he was not answering his phone. I told Beth that I was going home and that she should go home, and that we would talk later. I drove with the windows down. The air on the Chesapeake was cold and wet. Reaper, in the passenger seat, rested his chin on the doorframe and watched the road. I sat at my kitchen table at 14:45. I made a pot of coffee. I did not drink any of it. I cried, finally, for the first time in 5 months, with my elbows on the table and my forehead in my hands and Reaper sitting on my feet under the table. I cried for Caleb, who I had not been able to cry for properly all year, because I had been too busy being a widow correctly. I cried for Reaper, who was 9 years old and was going to retire that year and was going to be a couch dog for the rest of his life. I cried for myself, who had spent 10 years swallowing a small man's small cruelties because I had loved a kind man who had asked me to be patient with his father. When I was done crying, which was about 20 minutes later, I checked my phone. 11 missed calls. None of them were from Walt. 3 of them were from James Ellington. 2 were from Caleb's old team chief. 1 was from Beth. 1 was from Aunt Diane. 1 was from my mother. I called James first. He picked up on the second ring. He was already at the airport, on his way back to Coronado. He said, "Alexandra, I'm sorry I had to do that in the aisle. I had thought he would behave himself in the chapel. I was wrong. I needed to handle it before any of those young men did. They were a half second from putting hands on him, and that would have been the wrong story." I said, "James, don't apologize. I almost want to send you a card." He laughed quietly. He said, "Alexandra, call me on Monday. We have a retirement to plan." I said I would. We hung up. That night in our bedroom, I opened Caleb's footlocker for the first time since the funeral. It was olive drab, scratched, the same locker he had used since Bud/S. Inside was his beret and his trident, and a stack of letters from Reaper's first handler addressed to him by name, and a sealed envelope marked in Caleb's small, careful handwriting, "For Alexandra." If. I did not open it that night. I set it on the dresser. I sat on the edge of the bed in my running shorts and a t-shirt, and Reaper lay across my feet on the bedroom floor, and I told the ceiling, very quietly, because I had nobody else to tell, "Caleb, your dad finally did it." I do not know if Caleb heard me. I think he did. The dog at my feet did anyway, and the dog sighed in the long, old, comfortable way that working dogs sigh when the day is finally finished. That was how the day of the memorial ended. I went back to work the following Monday. I was in service khakis at 0700. Reaper at my heel. The kennel master Marcos was at the gate with 2 coffees. He handed me one. He said, "Heard the chapel was something yesterday, ma'am." I said, "It was." He said, "If the chief comes around the gate, you want me to handle him?" I said, "If he comes around the gate, you call me. He doesn't come past it." Marcos nodded once and walked off to do his job. That was the kind of thing Marcos did. He did not need a sentence. Walt called me at 19:30 hours that Monday night. He was furious in the controlled, performative way men of his generation are furious when they have been embarrassed in public and have rehearsed for several hours. He said, "Do you know what you did to me yesterday in front of the entire chapel? You let that Admiral humiliate me in front of every Whitman who is still speaking to me." I said, "Walt, I did not let him do anything. James Ellington is a rear admiral. He spoke for himself. He did not need my permission, and I did not give him a script." Walt said, "He had no right to bring up my career." I said, very calmly, "Walt, you hissed at a service dog at your son's memorial. You had no right to be there if you couldn't manage yourself." There was a silence. He hung up. 3 days later, on a Thursday, Walt drove out to Little Creek. He stood at the chain-link gate at the kennel and demanded entry. He was wearing a chief petty officer ball cap and a windbreaker. He was 68 years old. Marcos called me from the gatehouse. I came down on foot from the program offices. I did not bring Reaper. I stood on the inside of the gate, 3 feet from him, in service khakis, with my LCDR collar device on. He looked at me through the chain link the way he had looked at me at the wedding. The same small mouth. He said, "I want my son's dog." I said, "Walt, he is not your son's dog. He is a Naval Special Warfare working dog assigned to my program. He never belonged to anyone in your family, including me." Walt said, "I am his grandfather." I said, "Walt, he's a dog. You cannot be his grandfather. Go home." Walt's hand came up against the chain link. The links rattled very softly. I did not move. Marcos, in the gatehouse, came out and stood 20 feet behind me, and he did not say anything. But he was there, and Walt could see him. Walt said, with a different tone now, the tone of a man who has been told no by a woman one too many times in his life. "Alexandra, I am your father, your husband's father. I am the only father in your life. You owe me a hearing." I said, "Walt, I had a father. He was a Marine welder in Stockton, California. He died of a heart attack when I was 22. He was a difficult man, and he loved me, and I miss him every day. You have never been a father in my life. You have been my husband's father. That is a different role. You did not earn the first one, and you have just lost the second one, and you are not getting either of them back at the gate of my kennel on a Thursday morning." Walt stared at me for a long time. He had not expected the sentence about my father. He had been ready to argue. He was not ready to be addressed as the wrong man. He blinked twice. He took his hand off the chain link. He said, "I see." I said, "Walt, go home. Do not come back to this gate." He walked back to his car in the visitor lot. He sat in it for a long time in his ball cap, with his hands on the steering wheel. Marcos stayed in the gatehouse. I went back to my office. After about 15 minutes, Walt drove away. He did not come back to the kennel again. That weekend, I took Reaper to the beach at First Landing State Park. We walked very slowly along the wet sand. He found a piece of kelp and carried it for 100 yards. He was 9 years old. His muzzle was going silver. He looked at the waves and the gulls with the dignified, slightly bemused expression of an old man at a parade. I sat on a piece of driftwood. I watched him. I told the ocean quietly, "Caleb, I am going to be okay. Eventually. Don't worry." The dog ignored me. He had a piece of kelp. The next week, I took Reaper to his quarterly appointment at the Naval Special Warfare Veterinary Clinic. The young Navy veterinarian, a lieutenant in service khakis named Park, met us in the exam room. She had been Reaper's vet since he came back from his last deployment. She was professional, calm, gentle in the way good veterinarians are gentle. She got down on the floor with him. He licked her wrist once and then put his head on her thigh. She said, "Ma'am, the hips are slowing. He has mild osteoarthritis in both hocks. Nothing dramatic. We can manage it with anti-inflammatories. He is going to be a comfortable dog for the next 2 to 3 years if we keep him at a good weight and don't ask him to chase anything." I said, "Lieutenant, he is retiring next month." She smiled at the floor. She said, "Then he is going to be a very comfortable dog. He has earned a couch, ma'am." I scratched Reaper between the shoulder blades. He sighed. He did not lift his head off her thigh. The lieutenant said very quietly, "Master Chief, you do not have to do anything else hard for the rest of your life. We have got it from here." Reaper did not respond. He was already mostly asleep. I drove him home. He slept in the passenger seat the whole way, his nose against the window. I had not, until that drive, allowed myself to think of him as old. He was 9. He had been a kennel baby in the Belgian breeder's yard 9 years ago. He had been a 2-year-old maniac peeing on my boot in 2019. He had been Caleb's primary in 2022. He had been a Silver Star Master Chief in 2024. He was, on this Tuesday afternoon in May, a graying old soldier in my passenger seat on the way home from a vet appointment, ready to retire. The math caught up with me at a stoplight on Shore Drive. I cried for 45 seconds while the light was red. Then it turned green, and I drove home, and the day kept going. The week after the memorial, I sat down at my kitchen table with a sheet of notebook paper, and I wrote 2 lists. The first list was things I had given up to keep Walt comfortable. There were 11 items on it. They included my own seat at our wedding rehearsal dinner, the hospital chaplain at the birth of nothing, because we had not been able to have children and Walt had blamed me for that too, my speaking part at Caleb's promotion to senior chief, my preferred photo of Caleb on the funeral program, my place in the receiving line, and 7 more. I will not list the others. The list took me an hour. The second list was what I was going to take back. It was a shorter list. It said, the rest of my life. I called Aunt Diane that evening. I told her I was going to step back from the Whitman family. She said, "Honey, you are not stepping back from a family, you are stepping back from a man. There's a difference. Beth is your sister. I am your aunt. Caleb's brother in Tampa is going to be on the right side of this in 18 months when he stops being a coward, and then he will be your brother again. You are not losing us. You are losing him. He has been losing himself for 50 years. I cried again, briefly. I said, Caleb wanted me to be patient with him. She said, Caleb is gone. He'd want you to be at peace. Jenna, my best friend, who had been my maid of honor at my wedding and had been a Navy nurse before she got out and went to nursing school and became a civilian pediatric ICU nurse, called me that same week. She had not been able to come to the memorial. We talked for 2 hours on the phone. She asked me gently the only question that mattered. She said, Alexandra, why did you let him do this to you for a year? I sat with the question. I said, because Caleb wanted his father to feel important, and because grief made me tired, and because I thought I could absorb him for the year and then leave him behind, and the leaving would be cleaner if I did not give him a fight. Jenna said, Honey, he was never going to soften. People like Walt do not soften. They calcify. I said, I know that now. She said, You are allowed to have a year that's yours. You should take it. I said, I'm taking it. I picked up the For Alexandra. If envelope from my dresser 10 days after the memorial. I had not opened it yet. I held it for a long time. I sat at the kitchen table with the kettle on, Reaper at my feet. I opened it with a butter knife. There was a single sheet of notebook paper inside in Caleb's small, careful handwriting. It said, Alexandra, if you are reading this, I am sorry. I want you to do 3 things. 1. Take the dog. He's yours now. He always was. He just borrowed me for a while. 2. Take the year. Be sad in a way that is yours. Don't perform it for anyone. 3. Take my dad off your shoulders. He was never your weight. You carried him for me, and I love you for that. Set him down. He's not yours. He's not mine anymore either. I love you. See, I read it twice. I folded it into thirds. I put it on the refrigerator under a magnet next to a photograph Aunt Diane had sent me. A picture of Caleb at age 7 in a tiny sailor suit holding a stuffed dog by the ear. I looked at the dog at my feet. I said out loud, Okay, bud, okay. Reaper sighed. The kettle clicked. The week kept going. Beth drove down from Richmond the following Saturday. She had not been in my house since the funeral. She arrived at 10 in the morning with a tin of cookies that she had baked herself, badly, and a paperback novel for me, and a chew toy for Reaper. She's a high school history teacher. She's 36. She has Caleb's blue eyes and her mother's quietness. She had not, in 8 months, called me back. She apologized for that the moment I opened the door. I let her hug me. I had not been hugged by a Whitman, Caleb excluded, in over a year. We walked Reaper on the sand at First Landing for 2 hours. Beth told me stories about Caleb at 12. About the time he taught a stray neighborhood mutt to fetch the newspaper. About the time he tried to convince Walt to let him keep an injured raccoon in the garage. Walt had said no. Beth said, Dad has been saying no to dogs since I was 9, Alexandra. He hates them. I don't know why. He says they're dirty. He says they ruin furniture. He once kicked a beagle for stepping on his lawn. I'm not exaggerating. Caleb saw him do it. I had not known that. I had known Walt was bad with dogs. I had not known he was that bad with dogs. Beth said, Alexandra, I should have told you a long time ago. I am sorry I didn't. I said, Beth, you were 9 years old when your mother left. You were 18 when I met your brother. You have been protecting yourself from your father since you could speak. I am not angry at you for not protecting me. You did not owe me that. I am very glad you are here today, she cried, briefly. Reaper sat in the sand and watched the water. The gulls argued over a piece of shell. The afternoon was clean and bright, and the cold air off the bay was the kind of cold that wakes you up. We came back to my house. We ate the bad cookies. Beth said the cookies were bad on purpose, because Caleb had only ever liked bad cookies, and I laughed, and the laugh sounded strange in my own kitchen. Strange and welcome, like a song you used to know. Reaper, on his fleece bed, lifted his head when he heard the laugh. He tilted his ears. He decided it was acceptable. He went back to sleep. Beth left at 6 p.m. She said she would come back the following month. I told her she could come every month if she wanted, and bring the chew toys and the bad cookies. She said, "Alexandra, I will." She drove off in her old Subaru. I stood on the porch with Reaper at my heel and watched the taillights go down the street. And I felt, for the first time in 14 months, something that was not grief. It was not happiness either. It was the absence of a low siren that had been running in the background of my life. The siren had stopped. The street was very quiet. The retirement ceremony for Reaper was held at the NSW Group 2 parade ground at Little Creek 12 days after the memorial, on a Sunday morning in early May, at 1100 hours. We had moved it forward from the original October date because the kennel master Marcos and I had agreed, after the memorial, that there was no reason to make Reaper wait. He was 9. His hips were tired. His record was complete. The community wanted to honor him while he was still, in the way working dogs are still themselves, the dog he had always been. 300 people came. Caleb's old team came in service dress, every man of them. James Ellington flew back in from Coronado. Aunt Diane came down from Annapolis. Beth drove from Richmond with her husband. The brother in Tampa flew in, and Beth and I had agreed to pretend it was for the dog and not for an apology, and the brother had agreed to that too, and that was good enough for May. Walt was not at the ceremony. He had asked in writing to come. I had answered in writing in one line. Walt. The ceremony is closed, family. You may send a card. He had sent a card. The card was in a drawer at home. I had not read it. I do not know what it said. I think I will read it eventually. I think Beth is right that he is not, in the strict legal sense, irredeemable. I think people can change. I do not think Walt is going to, but I also do not think it is my job to wait for him. The ceremony was short. Reaper stood on a small raised platform in his clean working harness, his silver star streamer pinned through the loop. I stood at port arms beside him, in my service dress blues, my LCDR shoulder boards bright in the sun. James Ellington walked to the lectern. He read the citation in his calm public voice. He said, Master Chief Reaper, Naval Special Warfare. 8 combat deployments, Silver Star. Today, after 9 years of faithful service, this team is privileged to retire him to civilian life. Master Chief, your watch is relieved. The team commander, a captain in service dress, stepped forward and knelt at Reaper's level and lifted the harness loop and pinned the second streamer through it. The retirement streamer, with the crossed gold lines that mean honorably discharged into a soft afternoon. My left hand on Reaper's collar. Reaper, perfectly still. The team came to attention. The whole parade ground came to attention. I saluted. I did not cry. I was just very precisely not breathing, which is, in my experience, what the body does when crying would not be appropriate to the uniform. The 2 operators Reaper had shielded in 2024 were there. They had flown in for the ceremony. One of them was a senior chief named Ramirez. The other was a chief named Eames. Both of them had brought their families. Both of them, when the ceremony ended, came forward to the platform and knelt beside Reaper and put their hands on his shoulders. And neither one of them said anything because there was nothing left to say. Reaper licked Ramirez's wrist. Ramirez's 2-year-old daughter, in a small flowered dress, walked up and patted Reaper on the head, and Reaper, the way he always was with children, turned his enormous head very slowly and looked at her with infinite patience. The little girl said, "Doggy." Ramirez's wife, behind her, was crying without sound. I said very quietly to Ramirez and Eames, "Thank you for coming." Eames said, "Ma'am, thank you for the dog." Ramirez said, "Ma'am, he gave us our wives back. He gave us our kids back. We were not going to miss this." I shook their hands. They went back to their families. The little girl waved at Reaper from her father's hip. Reaper, in return, with great dignity, did the small head tilt he saved for children. The platform was warm in the May sun. After the ceremony, there was a receiving line. I shook 200 hands. Beth was in it, eyes red. Aunt Diane, Marcos, the young veterinarian Lieutenant Park from Reaper's clinic, the brother from Tampa who shook my hand without speaking and then hugged me without asking, and I let him because his shoulders were shaking. He whispered, "Alexandra, I should have called you a year ago. I'm sorry, I am here now." I said, "Tom, we will figure it out later." He nodded. He stepped back. He went to find Beth. James Ellington came through the line near the end. In dress blues, with 2 stars on each shoulder, the trident on his chest. He shook my hand the way an admiral shakes a lieutenant commander's hand. Firm, brief, professional. Then he held it a second longer. He said very quietly, "Alexandra, Caleb would have been proud of how you stood at the chapel last month. He would have been proud of how you stood today. I want you to know that." I said, "Sir." He said, "James." I said, "James, thank you." He nodded. He moved on. Reaper, beside me, watched him go. Aunt Diane was the last person in the line. She did not let go of my hand. She said, "Honey, he's at peace. The dog is yours. So is the rest of your life. Go take it." I said, "Aunt Diane, I will visit you in Annapolis next month." She said, "I will make a chowder." I said, "I will eat it." She kissed me on the cheek. She walked off across the parade ground in her blue church dress, with her cane, and the late afternoon light caught her white hair, and she did not look like a Whitman in that moment. She looked like a woman who had survived a bad family with her dignity, and who was going home to make a chowder for the niece her family had not deserved. I did not see Walt. I had not invited him. He was at home in Virginia with the card I had not read, and that was where he belonged. The night before the retirement ceremony, James Ellington had taken me to dinner at a quiet seafood place on Shore Drive. He was in civilian clothes, a navy blue blazer over a white shirt, and he ordered a club soda, and made me order one too because we were both, in his words, on duty until the streamer was pinned. He asked how I was. I told him the truth. I said, "James, I am, finally, all right. Most days. Some days I am furious. Most days I am all right." He said, "That's the schedule." That is exactly the schedule. It is going to be like that for another 2 years. Then it will be a different kind of all right. I asked him how he knew. He said his wife had died of pancreatic cancer in 2015. He had not remarried. He said, "I know the schedule, Alexandra. I have run the schedule." He said it with a small, grave smile that did not have any self-pity in it. He had been my husband's commanding officer in 2005. He had been a flag officer for 9 years. He had been a widower for 11. He had been, every time I had ever seen him, a man who did not flinch from the weight of his job, and tonight, in a navy blazer, in a coastal seafood place, with a basket of bread between us, he was telling me, in the gentle way old officers do, that I was going to live through this, and that the route was already mapped. I said, "James, thank you. For the chapel, for the year, for tonight." He said, "Alexandra, he was my chief, you're my LCDR. The dog's the dog. None of you is getting hissed at on my watch." I said, "I'm not going to forget that." He said, "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to live the rest of your life. The dog is going to be a couch dog. You are going to be a lieutenant commander running a kennel program for the next 10 years. You are going to ride a horse badly. You are going to eat dinner with your sister-in-law in Richmond. You are going to be all right." He paid the check. He drove me home in a rental car. Reaper was at the door when I came in. The dog and the Admiral, in the doorway, regarded each other the way old soldiers do. James said, "Master Chief, tomorrow's your day. Sleep well." Reaper sighed. The Admiral drove away. 2 weeks after the retirement ceremony, on a Saturday morning, I sat on my couch in jeans and a sweatshirt with no name tape and no rank insignia, and I drank coffee, and Reaper lay on his fleece bed by the back door. He looked at his leash. He looked at me. He sighed in the heavy, comfortable way old dogs sigh. I put down my coffee. I said, "All right, Master Chief, let's go look at the bay." He stood up slowly, the way he stood up now, with care, and he walked to the door, and we went. We walked along the sand at First Landing State Park. He moved at his own pace. I picked up a tennis ball somebody had left and threw it 3 feet, very carefully, the way you throw a ball for an old dog, and he retrieved it grandly and presented it back. And then he lay down in the sand, and he did not get up for 45 minutes. He had spent his whole life running for things that mattered. He had earned a slow walk. When we got home, I made a sandwich. I sat at the kitchen table. Reaper asleep on the rug, the photo of 7-year-old Caleb on the refrigerator, the letter beside it, the morning sun across the floorboards. I opened my phone and looked at a flyer for an introductory horsemanship clinic in November at a stable on the Eastern Shore. I had ridden once, 18 years ago, before the Navy, on a borrowed quarter horse at a friend's farm in Modesto. I had been bad at it. I had been thrown twice. I had not gotten back on after the second time because the friend's father had said something about how women should not ride horses, and I had been 20 years old, and I had taken it personally, and I had not been on a horse since. I wanted to be bad at something again. I wanted to be a beginner. I was tired of being good at carrying things. I signed up for the clinic on my phone. I paid the deposit. The confirmation email came through with a list of what to bring and a small note that read, "Riders of all skill levels welcome, including absolute beginners. We will not throw you off. We promise." I laughed once at the kitchen table. Reaper, on the rug, opened one eye. He looked at me with the mild, patient expression he saved for moments when his handler had decided something on her own without consulting him. He went back to sleep. Aunt Diane sent me a chowder recipe in the mail 2 weeks later, written by hand on a recipe card with a note that said, "Visit when you can." I taped it to the inside of a cabinet. Beth came down again the following weekend with a different bag of bad cookies. The brother in Tampa called, awkward and apologetic, on a Sunday afternoon, and I let him talk for 40 minutes without interrupting, and at the end of it he said, "Alexandra, I'm sorry for all of it." I said, "Tom, we will start with this phone call. There is no rush." He cried. I let him. We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the dog on the rug, and I thought, very plainly, this is the rest of my life starting. It started slowly. It started in conversations. It started in chowder recipes and unread cards and bad cookies and a dog asleep on a rug. It started, finally, without Walt in the room. If somebody in your family has spent years making you smaller, you do not have to argue with them. You do not have to humiliate them in public. You do not even have to be the one to handle it. Sometimes the room handles it for you because the room has been watching, and the room has been waiting, and the truth in the room has been quietly accumulating like a tide. You can simply walk out of the small room they put you in and stand somewhere with better light. The truth always catches up. It catches up at the chapel door. It catches up at the kennel gate. It catches up at the kitchen sink with a coffee cup in your hand and an old dog sleeping on your floor. And once it does, the rest of your life starts. Mine started in a chapel last April, in front of 300 people. When an Admiral I never asked for help from looked at my father-in-law and told him quietly that the dog at my heel outranked him. The Admiral has not, since that day, mentioned it. The Admiral did not need to. He had said it once, and he had meant it. And the truth had been waiting in the room a long time before he gave it words. If you've been the one in the family who held your tongue for years to keep the peace, for a partner, for a parent, for somebody else's father, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Were you the patient one? Did somebody else finally handle it for you the way James handled it for me? And if you're a working dog handler, or you've ever loved a dog the way I love Reaper, I want to hear about your dog too. Drop a comment, hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and the bell so the next one finds you. Thank you for sitting through this with me. Reaper's asleep on the floor. He says hello.